Bring back to our show Texas Senator Ted Cruz, great friend of the show and somebody who's been tough on crime during his career. Senator Cruz, a bunch of things to talk about with you. We're so pleased that you are back. But this crime thing is still first and foremost. We are in a crisis here in New York City, as you probably know. But I dare say we're in a crisis across the country. I put the blame at Biden's feet. I think that he is a cause of this thing. There are lots of causes, though. Let me get your opening thoughts on this crime wave here in New York and around the country and what must be done.
Well, Larry, I very much agree with you. Right now, the entire country is standing in solidarity with the NYPD, with the men and women in blue who risk their lives to keep us safe. And we're seeing crime skyrocketing across the country. We're seeing murder rates skyrocketing across the country. We're seeing violent assaults and deadly assaults on police officers rising all across the country. And it is a direct result of the anti-police rhetoric, the hatred, the venom and extremism we've seen on the left. You know, a year ago, we saw riots. We saw 574 officially declared riots all over the country, Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots, as they firebombed police cars, as they looted and burned stores, as they assaulted innocent civilians. And Democratic politicians celebrated it. They went on TV and they called it the Summer of Love. Over 2,000 police officers were violently assaulted during those supposedly peaceful protests. It was grotesque. It was wrong. And what were Democratic politicians doing? Well, Kamala Harris was bailing out the violent rioters from prison, raising money to bail them out. And now we've seen with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they've taken these same radicals and they put them at senior positions in the federal government. Two of the leading advocates of abolishing the police are now among the senior officials at the U.S. Department of Justice. Joe Biden nominated them, and every single Democrat in the Senate voted to confirm them. It is wrong, and we need to stop this incredible hostility to police officers. We need to have the back of the men and women in blue.
You know, this message, Senator Cruz, this message from Biden yesterday, which is really sort of the traditional message about gun control. And really, New York, as you may know, sir, has, if not the toughest, among the toughest gun control laws in the country, yet we are experiencing our worst crime wave in memory. He calls it the iron pipeline. And I love this, Senator. He blames I-90. He blames the state of Georgia coming up through I-95. I mean, I have two thoughts on that. A, why not blame criminals? But B, you know, sir, if you want to blame borders, state borders, how about the southern border of the United States, which Biden has completely open to guns, drugs, sex trafficking, and you know what?
Look, you are exactly right. Unfortunately, facts don't matter to today's Democrats. Reason and data don't matter. If you look at virtually all of the jurisdictions that have the toughest gun control laws, almost without exception, they have the highest crime rates and the highest murder rates. If you look at places like the state of Texas, where we protect the right to keep and bear arms, you see much lower crime rates, much lower murder rates. And when you have gun control, what you end up doing is disarming the citizenry. But the criminals, the gangbangers, they buy their guns illegally and they continue to commit crimes. They just do so from people who can't defend themselves. And I'll tell you, if you want to understand why crime rates are skyrocketing, why in California you can turn on the TV and see people just breaking into stores and looting like crazy. The reason is leftist prosecutors. George Soros has personally funded millions of dollars to elect radical pro-crime prosecutors across the country. Now, I say that, and that sounds a reasonable person would say, come on, what's a pro-crime prosecutor? Let me give you an example. Rachel Rollins. Rachel Rollins was the district attorney in Suffolk County in Massachusetts. Joe Biden appointed her to be the U.S. attorney for the entire state of Massachusetts, the chief federal law enforcement officer in Massachusetts. Rachel Rollins, when she was a state DA, put out a list of 15 crimes that she ordered her prosecutors not to prosecute. Trespassing. So someone trespasses onto your home, they won't prosecute it. Possession not just of marijuana, possession of PCP, of cocaine, of heroin, of fentanyl, they don't prosecute it. Resisting arrest, violence. You ended up having violent activities and these radicals essentially saying, we don't prosecute violence. I'll give you another example. You remember a couple of months ago, the horrific crime of that lunatic who drove his red SUV into a Christmas parade, murdering people, murdering children. That lunatic was on parole. He was on parole for the crime of driving his SUV into someone else. Same red SUV. It was, I believe, his ex-girlfriend. He ran her down, and a Soros DA let him out on $1,000 bail. And he went out, and he got in the same SUV, and he murdered a bunch more people. When you let violent criminals go, they commit crimes of violence. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they can't understand that basic cause and effect.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and also, by the by, also has a very detrimental effect on the economy, as I pointed out time and time again.
Sure.
The two
Absolutely.
go hand in hand. Speaking of laws, Senator Cruz, 76% of American voters, according to at least one poll, object strenuously to using race and gender quotas for the Supreme Court. 76% object to race and gender quotas on the Supreme Court. And yet, President Biden went right ahead anyway.
Well, if you or I did it, it would be blatantly illegal. If Larry Kudlow advertised, I want a producer on the show and it must be a black woman, you would have violated federal civil rights law. By the way, you couldn't advertise you wanted a white man or a Native American woman either. You're not allowed to discriminate based on race. That's what our laws are. And what Joe Biden is doing here is the Democrats, they affirmatively support racial discrimination when it fits with their politics. Listen, if he wanted to do a search of all the candidates and find who he thought was the best qualified candidate and nominate that candidate, if that candidate happened to be a black woman, wonderful. That's something very different from saying at the outset that 94% of Americans are ineligible, that Joe Biden will not even consider them no matter what their record. They're ineligible because he wants to discriminate based on race. And I got to say, that is the modern Democratic Party. You know, just last week, we had a Biden district court nominee, an Asian American woman, who had written this really radical article in law school attacking other Asian Americans and saying any Asian American who didn't support discriminating against Asian Americans was not woke enough. They were participating in prejudice. It was bizarre. And Larry, I got to say, I asked her a very simple question. Is racial discrimination wrong? Now, that ought to be an easy question. Any normal person ought to say, yeah, of course it is. She refused to answer. She's like, well, the Supreme Court said this, said that. I said, look, it's a simple question. Is it right or wrong? She refused to answer. And the reason Joe Biden said this is in far left circles, it is virtue signaling to say, I am discriminating based on race. And I'll tell you, even more troubling, I don't know who the nominee is going to be, but I'll bet you dollars to donuts that Biden's going to nominate someone to the Supreme Court that'll follow the pattern of his judicial nominees the past year, that will follow the pattern of nominating radical leftists who are political activists, who will undermine free speech, undermine religious liberty, undermine the Second Amendment, who are radicals in robes. I don't know that for sure, but I can tell you that's who he's nominated for a year. And that's really dangerous for Americans who care about the rule of law, who care about the judiciary upholding the Constitution.
So let me switch gears. There's this, we've saved America and killed the bill, at least for now. Build Back Better is dead. But they're still fighting Build Back Better, smaller and chunkier. And I invite your attention, I'm sure you've seen this Compete with China bill, which is about $350 billion, no pay-fors, handouts, subsidies. We're trying to out-China China. Now, Senator Cruz, I appeal to you. There's a better way. There's these two crazy guys in the Wall Street Journal today, Kudlow and Moore, who wrote an op-ed saying Make the Trump tax cuts permanent, all right? Now, that would be competition. Make low corporate tax rate, continue immediate expensing, make it easy to repatriate funds, no minimum taxes, no tax hikes, no overseas tax hikes. How about that for starters? Why don't we just make those tax cuts permanent? You were for those tax cuts. Now's the time.
Larry, you're exactly right, except that makes far too much sense for today's Democrats to do it. I've introduced legislation to make the Trump tax permanent. And the Trump tax cuts permanent, and there's a reason for that. They produced incredible results. When we passed those tax cuts, we saw the lowest unemployment in 50 years. We saw the lowest African-American unemployment ever produced in the United States of America, lowest Hispanic unemployment ever recorded, lowest youth unemployment in 70 years, lowest unemployment for women in 70 years. They worked incredibly, but look, there's a philosophical point why the Democrats are opposed to that. It's almost like we're living out Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. The Democrats want Washington, a handful of influence peddlers, to be giving out the billions of dollars. They favor corporate welfare. They favor politicians doling out favors to their friends because it protects their power. If you cut taxes and small businesses are allowed to flourish and grow, you don't have influence peddlers in Washington deciding who wins and who loses, and their whole business model is predicated upon making everyone come to them on bended knee. I think we shouldn't be supporting the big guys. We ought to be supporting the little guys, the entrepreneurs, the moms and pops that are creating jobs. And we've just come through a year with Democratic politicians shutting down small businesses, destroying jobs, and making it harder and harder for people to survive. I think people are fed up with it.